Westmoreland Chapel, March 13th, 1994.
Daniel, the second chapter. Remember, we were introduced to Daniel last Lord's Day, and we saw how that Daniel, because he refused to defile himself, he and his three friends, how they were accepted into the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian kingdom, and now we have Daniel, the second chapter before us today. Anybody know what the big thing is in Daniel 2? Very good, Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And this, as we're going to see, is a very important dream. Now let's first of all read the first 13 chapters. It's quite a long chapter, so we're going to have to move along to get through it. The first 13 verses of the second chapter. Now in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. Then the king gave command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I have had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation. But the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, My decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you will be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap. Now, by the way, you'll notice there's a change here in the New King James and also in all of the revised versions from the Old King James, what the Old King James had. Instead of the king saying, my decision is firm, as it's in there in verse 5, he said, in the Old King James, he said, the matter is gone from me. Which indicated that the king couldn't remember his dream. But some further scholarship since King James' time has indicated that instead of translating that, the matter is gone from me, that my decision is firm is better. Now that indicates that the king did remember his dream, but he wouldn't tell the magicians and the astrologers because he was going to use it as an indication of whether these men really had supernatural powers or not. Now I think really that it gives a better interpretation of the whole chapter, that translation, because it shows that the king, you see, was suspicious of these men. He had had a lot to do with them already, and he had become suspicious because a lot of their prophecies didn't come true, and they were always nebulous, and so he devised this test, and he says, now if you can tell me what I dreamed, then I'll know that you can give me an interpretation. But if you can't tell me, I'll know that you're just giving me the runaround. And so I think that if you remember that, it helps you to understand the chapters a little better. Verse 6, however, if you tell the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. Therefore tell me the dream and its interpretation. They answered again and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will give its interpretation. The king answered and said, I know for certain that you would gain time because you see that my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, there is only one decree for you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time has changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation. See, he practically says as much right there. Tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore, no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such things of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. It's a difficult thing that the king requires, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. For this reason the king was angry and very furious, and gave a command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went out, and they began killing the wise men, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Now let's stop there and just think for a minute about what some of the things we might get from this passage. One thing is that God's sovereignty over Satan and his kingdom in this world is well as illustrated here. Now notice how God now Satan had chosen this man Nebuchadnezzar to be the king over practically the whole civilized world, or at least a great portion of it. And we know that Satan is the ruler of the world's governments, and so he chose Nebuchadnezzar. Now, isn't it amazing that God in his sovereignty chose to give this marvelous dream, which was going to reveal the plan of the ages to everybody in the whole world? He chose to give it to this Satan's man, Nebuchadnezzar. I think that shows a marvelous... It's almost as if God is mocking Satan, and taking his man and giving him this marvelous dream, which is going to give the future of the times of the Gentiles. Remember, he did the same thing with Pharaoh in Joseph's time. He gave him a dream that was going to reveal the future. Now, another thing I think that it shows God's sovereignty, in that it would expose the weakness of Satan's spiritual leaders, these magicians and astrologers. You see, it showed them up. The king's own test showed them up that they just had no more than just earthly wisdom and knowledge. The only way they could possibly tell Nebuchadnezzar what he dreamed was to have supernatural wisdom. Well, you see, they didn't have any supernatural wisdom. Or if they did, it wasn't sufficient to give Nebuchadnezzar his dream. And so God, in his sovereignty, you see, reveals their weakness too, and shows them that unless you have God himself, the power of God himself, you can't reveal these things. Another thing this shows us is that God spreads the knowledge of himself. By dealing with the greatest ruler of the world at the time, God ensured maximum publicity. So he takes this man Nebuchadnezzar and he gives him the dream, and everything that happens to Nebuchadnezzar is going to go out to the ends of the world at that time. Now, if it had happened to some other person, maybe just to Daniel, of course, it wouldn't have gone out as far because Daniel wasn't that well known. But if it happened to Nebuchadnezzar, it was going to be published abroad to the whole world. And so God gave it to him. God gave him the dream containing the future course of history, but the interpretation of the dream God gave to his own man only. In other words, he made it very clear that Nebuchadnezzar isn't the key to this. It's really Daniel is the key, because Nebuchadnezzar has the dream, but he doesn't know what it means until Daniel can tell him. And so God spreads the knowledge of himself through Nebuchadnezzar, but he makes Nebuchadnezzar dependent upon Daniel's God. So it's really Daniel's God that gets the widespread publicity, as we see as we go on. All right, now God reveals Nebuchadnezzar's dream in verses 14 to 23. Let's take a look at those now. Then with counsel and wisdom Daniel answered Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, "Why is the decree from the king so urgent?" Then Arioch made the decision known to Daniel. So Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time, that he might tell the king the interpretation. Then Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and his companions, that they might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. So Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we ask of you. For you have made known to us the king's demand." Now, here we can learn some things. It's important, particularly in crises, to deal with the world in counsel and wisdom. Now notice, the decree had gone out, and this man Arioch was going to carry it out to kill all the wise men, including Daniel and his companions. And so this Arioch comes in, and he's got the death of Daniel and his companions in his hand. I mean, he's going to take them out and kill them. And so it was a very ticklish situation. And it required counsel and wisdom. And notice, it says, with counsel and wisdom, Daniel answered Arioch. Now, if he'd gone out there and in a bad spirit, why, the result might have been much different. But in dealing with the world, we need to be careful how we deal with them, that we're dealing with them in a right way. And Daniel, all through his life, we can see how really, in most instances, he is so courteous and respectful in dealing with these men of the world. And they responded to his spirit and his attitude. And then, another thing we see, that in a time of crisis, godly people will resort to prayer, and especially united prayer. Notice that's the first thing Daniel does when he finds out what's going to happen. He heads for his companions, and they engage in united prayer. And as a result, God answers their prayer, and then we see that they take the time and the effort to give God thanks and praise for their answered prayer. And Daniel, of course, is a man of prayer. We see that at every time we see him practically. He's an outstanding man of prayer. And we see in this thanksgiving that he gives to God. Look at verses 19. It says, so Daniel blessed God. And then verse 20, blessed be the name of God forever and ever. And then in verse 23, I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. In other words, he's full of worship and thanksgiving and praise to the Lord. Then the second thing this prayer shows is that he is impressed especially with the power of God. In verse 3, he changes the times and the season. He removes kings and raises up kings. In other words, Daniel's God is the God who just moves the nations around and moves the great kings around and sets up one and puts down another. He's the sovereign God of great power. And then also he's the God of great wisdom and knowledge. He says in verse 21, he gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. If anybody has any wisdom or knowledge, it's because God has given it to them. He reveals deep and secret things, verse 22. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. And then he thanks God for making known this secret to him. All right, now we're going to move on to the main part of the chapter. Daniel explains the dream, verse 24 to 45. Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me before the king, and I will tell the king the interpretation. Then Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king and said thus to him, I have found a man of the captives of Judah who will make known to the king the interpretation. The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen in its interpretation? Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, and magicians and soothsayers cannot declare to the king, but there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. Now, notice here that it seems to me that Daniel, in a very gracious way, says that this is not an earthly matter, but a heavenly matter, and in doing so, he excuses the wise men for not knowing it. He says, look, king, you're just demanding too much. These men may know earthly things, but not heavenly things. But he said, in this case, you have to have the God of heaven to reveal it to you. And he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar. Notice how modestly he speaks here too. He doesn't say, he made known to me. He says he made it known to you. He completely leaves himself out there. Daniel is a remarkable person. He is just a remarkable person all the way through. Just a tremendous man of God. All right, now another thing in the next verse, he says in verse 29, as for you, O king, thoughts came to your mind while on your bed about what would come to pass after this. And he who reveals secrets has made known to you what will be. So you see, the king was laying on his bed. The background of this dream was the king was laying on his bed and he was wondering what would happen to his kingdom. What would come to pass after this? I mean, he had a great kingdom and was in control of all things, and he was wondering just what was going to be the outcome of it all. And so God gives him a dream showing him much more than he wondered about. Verse 30. But as for me, this secret has not been revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anyone living, but for our sakes who made known the interpretation to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your heart. Again, you see Daniel's humility here. He says, I'm not any special person, king, but the reason that God has made this known is, now notice the two reasons he gives. For our sakes who make known the interpretation. In other words, he's saying that it's given as a revelation to the people of God. And certainly that has been true all down through the ages. It's the people of God who really are interested in this. The world, of course, is ignoring it. But it's the people of God that are really interested in it. And also he even includes the king in this. So Daniel is very, very respectful toward this King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, verse 31, You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image, this great image whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. The image head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This is the dream. Now we will tell the interpretation of it before the king. You, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heaven, he has given them into your hand, and has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold. But after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, then a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters all things. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. Whereas you saw the feet and the toes partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. Yet the strength of iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Inasmuch as you saw the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. All right, now let's go back over this tremendous revelation that was given to Nebuchadnezzar through Daniel. In the first place, we see that this image represented the Gentile kingdoms from Daniel's time clear to the time of the end when God is going to set up his own kingdom. So it's a revelation of the government of the world from Daniel's time, which was about 500 BC, to the time of Christ coming and setting up his kingdom on earth. So this really takes in the whole span of history. As we're going to see, however, there's a span of history that's really left out of this image, and I think it's very important to see this, as we'll see a little bit later. First of all, let's look at the image in verse 31. It was a great image. Its splendor was excellent. Its form was awesome. Now we see from this something that the devil showed to Jesus when he showed him all the kingdoms of the world, and then Matthew adds, and their glory. Now the kingdoms of the Gentiles have glory. They're awesome. They're great. And the devil has a lot of power, and he gives his power and his greatness to, he lends some of it to these kingdoms. Now, notice in verses 32 to 35, where the image is being described, and also the stone that's cut out without hands. Now, I went through and I counted the words given to the image. The words given to the description of the image are 32 words. The words told about the fifth kingdom, in other words, he describes 4 kingdoms in 32 words, and the last kingdom, the kingdom of Messiah, he gives 79 words to it. So you can see the emphasis in this revelation is not upon the kingdoms of the Gentiles, but upon the kingdom of God that's going to be set up at the end of this time. And I think that's an important thing to remember as we think about this. Now, first of all, the first kingdom is the head of gold, Nebuchadnezzar, verse 37. He's King of Kings. He has power, strength, and glory. He's ruler over them all, verse 38. Now, it's definitely said in the next verse, I believe it's verse 39, after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours. Now, in what way was the second kingdom, which is the kingdom of Persia, inferior to Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian kingdom? Because actually the kingdom of Persia covered a lot more territory. So it wasn't in the extent of the kingdom that it was inferior. But I believe that the words here, he's King of Kings, power, strength, glory, ruler over them all. And also the very fact that his is the head of gold. And of course, you know what gold stands for in the Bible. It always refers to God. And so in the power that Nebuchadnezzar had, in the absolute form of his monarchy, in other words, he had such absolute power that his kingdom conformed more to the kingdom of God than any others, in that sense. I was reading in a world history book about the kingdom of Babylon, and especially in Nebuchadnezzar's time, and I noticed that they called it in there the absolute monarchy of Babylon. And that's what God's rule is. You see, it's an absolute monarchy. I mean, God is absolutely the all-powerful one in his kingdom. And Nebuchadnezzar came the closest of any ruler to being an image of God in his power over his kingdom. I think that's why he's called the head of gold. Gold always in the Bible, or I believe, I can't think of any exceptions to it, gold always referring to God. All right, now let's move on to verse 32, the chest and arms of silver. Now, of course, this kingdom is not identified because it hasn't taken place yet in Daniel's time. Now, Daniel identifies that the head of gold is the kingdom of Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. But he can't identify any of the rest of them because they haven't arisen yet in his time. But we can identify them. He says, after you, another kingdom inferior to yours. Now, what we know from the book of Daniel, however, what kingdom followed, the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar, we know from Daniel 5 that the Persians, the Medo-Persian Empire, took over. and remove Babylon. And of course the great king over Medo-Persia was Cyrus. And I noticed in this world history that I was looking at, it says that Cyrus was careful to respect the institutions and ways of his new subjects. The result was a diverse empire. In other words, Cyrus let the Iranians rule like they wanted to, and let the Babylonians rule like they wanted to. In other words, he let them carry on their own ways and their own institutions. He didn't try to conform everything to him. And consequently, his became a kingdom that was united by his power, but it had a lot of disunity in it, in that everybody carried on with their own ways. And so it didn't correspond to God's kingdom, where God's will is done everywhere in his kingdom. Cyrus's will wasn't done everywhere in his kingdom. He let everybody do his own thing. And so in that sense it was inferior to Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. Now the descending value of the four metals suggests a degeneration of man and government from gold to clay. Now notice that. We start with gold, the head is gold, and then silver, then bronze, then iron, and then iron and clay finally. So you start out with a metal that suggests God, and you end up with a metal that suggests man. And so the kingdoms, you see, become more and more ungodlike in their absolutism, until finally you get down, and I think the clay indicates something about the government. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, let's go to the third kingdom. Its belly, and this is in verse 32, its belly and thighs of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. Now that's significant. Verse 39 says that it shall rule over all the earth. Because Alexander's kingdom went farther than any other kingdom up to that time. And this is the kingdom of Alexander the Great. And I got from the world history this quotation about Alexander's kingdom. Weak as the cement of Alexander's empire must have been, it suffered intolerable strain when he died without an heir. And so after he died, why, his generals carved up his kingdom. But you see, Alexander's kingdom didn't last very long, and it was even when he was still alive, it was weak as far as unity went, because it was so great that he just didn't have the power to govern everybody, and he didn't have the men to do it either. So it was a weaker in unity and in absolute power than the Persian kingdom was. All right, now we go down to the fourth kingdom. This is verse 33. The legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay, verse 33. Now, and that's, by the way, should be translated baked clay. This is not referring at all to soft clay, but to clay after it's baked in a kiln and becomes like ceramic. Now the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron and will crush all the others. And of course this refers to the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire did arise and it crushed the Grecian kingdoms that were formed under Alexander's generals. And it took over Persia and Babylon. And in extent, it reached farther than any of the other kingdoms. But it says that this kingdom was partly of iron and partly of clay. The kingdom shall be divided, partly strong and partly fragile. This is verses 41 and 42. As you saw iron mixed with clay, this is verse 43, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another. Now, in the interpretation, the first kingdom is given 63 words, the second kingdom is given 10 words, the third 14 words, and the fourth 133 words. So you see that of the four kingdoms, the great stress, especially in the interpretation, is put upon the Roman kingdom. And most of the time it's taken up in fact very little, if any, is taken up with the legs. Most of it is taken up with the toes and the feet, which were made out of a mixture of iron and clay. Now, since the metals represented monarchies of growing weakness, the clay must represent something else, another government beside monarchies. And I think one man here says, Mr. Gabeline says, the metals represent monarchies, but the clay, democratic rule. In other words, the rule of men. And this introduces weakness. The final form of the kingdom will include diverse elements. This will prevent it from having real unity, born out of the fact that the world empire at the end breaks up into gigantic civil war in which the forces of the south, the east, and the north contend with the rulers of the Mediterranean for supremacy, as Daniel himself portrays in chapter 11. Now, what he's saying here is that, as I said before, this image represents history from Daniel's time to the time of Christ coming back and forming his kingdom. But we saw that most of the image represents, from the head down to the legs, represent those four empires that we think of as almost closing with the time of Christ. Now, but the feet and the clay, most of the time is taken up with them. But what do they represent? Well, they don't represent anything that you can point out in history. So they must represent, in fact, there's good reason from the text to believe that they represent the kingdoms at the time of the end, right before Christ's return. Because the stone hits them. It doesn't hit the legs. It doesn't hit the head. It doesn't hit the body parts. It hits the feet and the toes. That means that the feet and the toes must represent the Gentile ruling kingdoms that are going to be present at the time when Christ returns. And he destroys them. And then the whole image comes down. And the fact that at the end time there's going to be 10 kingdoms is indicated by the 10 toes, and is also indicated by, notice in verse 44, and in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. What kings is he talking about? Well, it's the kings of the 10 toes, the 10 kings indicated by the 10 toes. Now, in this particular chapter, Daniel doesn't go into that. However, we can learn from other sources that this is true, especially in the days of these kings refers to the kings who ruled during the last generation of Gentile power. Now, this is indicated in Daniel 7 and in Revelation 17, which we won't go into now, but I think it's clear that the toes and the feet represent those kingdoms that are going to be present at the time that Christ returns, and he's going to destroy them. Now, this is very important to us because we're talking about our own day. We're living in the days of the feet and the toes. And what's going to happen, I think it was this fellow Walvard, who used to be the president of Dallas Seminary, says in his book on Daniel that the final form of the kingdom will include diverse elements. This will prevent it from having real unity, borne out by the fact that the world empire at the end breaks up into a gigantic civil war in which the forces of the south, the east, and the north contend with the rulers of the Mediterranean for supremacy, as Daniel himself portrays in Daniel 11. Now, I think this really throws a lot of light on prophecy at the Armageddon, because it seems best to interpret Armageddon not as one battle, but as a series of battles. That at the time of the end, these 10 kingdoms, they start fighting against one another. The king of the south and the king of the north and the king of the east. By the way, it doesn't mention the king of the west because I think that's the Antichrist himself who eventually takes over all the others. But it does show you that there's going to be, and we can see it in the making now, where there's so much disunity, there's so much nationalism and so forth we see, and it's as he said, there's going to be a giant civil war at the end time, which is going to be taken advantage of by the Antichrist. All right, now, the 10-toe stage is simultaneous and were destroyed by one sudden catastrophic blow. By the way, I left out some here. Let's see, where is it? Now, there's, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of amillennialism and postmillennialism. The amillennialists, there's a lot of Christians that believe this, that there isn't going to be any millennium in the sense of Christ ruling on earth over the world for 1,000 years. What they believe is that the stone cut out without hands was Christ's first coming, and he began a gradual taking over of the world at that time. And of course the trouble with that is that here we are after 2,000 years of Christ taking over the world, and he hasn't taken it over yet. I mean, it seems like it's almost further from being true than it was in the past. And also, the text itself says that this is going to be a sudden thing. I mean, this stone hit the feet and the toes and destroyed them, and they were like chaff. They blew away, and there was found no place for them. And so it was a sudden, catastrophic thing. And when we look, we don't find anything like that has ever happened in history. But when we look at prophecy, we find that that is very clearly prophesied that Christ is going to come back and there's going to be a great catastrophe in which he smashes the nations, in which he takes over the kingdoms of the world. And so that's very clearly prophesied. So that the premillennial idea of Christ coming back first and then the millennium being set up, the amillennialists say that the church is going to bring in the millennium, and just by gradual taking over of the world through evangelism. But of course we can see that that isn't taking place, and the prophecy really doesn't indicate that anyway. Okay, now let's last here, let's look at verse 45, the stone cut out of the mountain without hands. Now what does that emphasize? Well, that emphasizes that it's going to be God's doing. The human hands are not going to be in on this, setting up this last kingdom. And verse 34 says, it struck the image of it on its feet and of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. The destruction comes in the days of these kings, verse 44. In other words, in the final stage of the last empire. And look at verse 35. No trace of them was found. In other words, he's going to so utterly destroy all human government, all Gentile power. There's not going to be a trace of it found left. And the stone became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. The God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. It shall stand forever. And then last of all, Daniel and his friends are promoted, verses 46 through 49. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face prostrate before Daniel and commanded that they should present an offering and incense to him. The king answered Daniel and said, truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of lords, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret. Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief administrator over the wise men of Babylon. And Daniel petitioned, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king. And so here, by the working of God, Daniel, without lifting a finger of his own, is made a big man under this satanic kingdom. It's just a marvelous thing how God is able to do such great things even in the presence of his enemies. Shall we pray? Father, we thank you for the great grace with which you've revealed to us what's going to happen in this world all through the ages, from the time of Daniel until the time of the end. And so we have this assurance given us that the dream is certain and its interpretation is sure. We don't have to worry about what's going to happen. We know that we're in the last stages of this times of the Gentiles. We're living in the times of the feet of clay, of the feet and toes of clay and iron. And we know that the stone cut out of the mountain without hands is going to hit with terrible power that feet and toes of clay and iron, and there's going to be a smashing that is going to completely obliterate all human government, and divine government through the Prince of Peace himself is going to take place on this earth for 1,000 years. And we thank you for it in Jesus' name. Amen.